Well, thank you, Greg. I do appreciate it, and I think my voice will project well enough. It's tempting to hold the microphone, but it makes me feel like a stand-up comedian, and I really don't want to do that. Yes, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I've always been someone who appreciates Civil War roundtables because the Bucks County Civil War Roundtable back in Pennsylvania, my neck of the woods, meant a lot to me growing up. We're actually really, really blessed because if you look up the Bucks County Civil War Roundtable, you'll also find the Bucks County Civil War Roundtable and Museum. One of its members left his entire will, or a major part of his will, to the roundtable for the purpose of making a museum. And it's really a cool opportunity. I ended up roping my dad into it. He became the president. I became one of the board members. My mom did a talk about the spy Elizabeth Van Lowe. So my whole family kind of got co-opted into the Civil War because of my interest. But yeah, I'm a Yankee. I'm from Pennsylvania, so it's just kind of how it is. But before I get to talking about Adelbert Ames, how many of you, and I guess this is probably most, have seen the movie Gettysburg? A fair amount, I reckon, right? Ames is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's original CO. So that's who he is. And if you've seen the movie Gods and Generals, which is weird because it's supposed to be a prequel, but they're all 10 years older and they're a lot heavier and grayer. But Ames is actually in that movie Gods and Generals. He's actually the very uptight colonel, young colonel, who's training this regiment from Maine that's going to go to the war and become quite famous.
I'm reading the Chamberlain biography that talks a lot about it.
Which biography, I might ask? Oh, the new one? Okay, yeah. So I have not actually read it, but I've read Truell's book. I've read Pullman's book on the 20th Maine. But so Ames is a character that some people have described almost as like a Forrest Gump-like character because he seems to always be popping up places. That's actually what my thesis advisor said. He kind of reminds me of Forrest Gump. He's always popping up in different places. But at the same time, my advisor, Dr. Ken No, who has gone on to retire, but his most recent work actually was nominated for the Lincoln Prize. So like pretty accomplished historian. He said, but the difference between Ames and Forrest Gump, though, is that Forrest Gump a lot of times is just observing things. He's just witnessing things. Ames is actually accomplishing things. He's actually a part of events that happen. And so my objective today is just tell the story of Adelbert Ames and who he is. He's also the subject of my first book, hopefully not my last book. Greg and I were talking about future research projects that are down the pipeline. But before I get his story, I have to briefly talk about my story. Because when I was in my grad program for my master's thesis, I was supposed to pick a topic to write about over the course of the summer, and I failed. I did not come up with a good topic. So there I am at the beginning of the fall semester when I'm supposed to be doing research for my very master's thesis, and I have nothing. Well, I happen to turn on Gods and Generals, and I see this Ames character. I'm like, well, he's associated with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Chamberlain's kind of a famous fellow. He's got a lot of biographies. Does this Ames guy have a biography? And it turns out he only has one, and it's written by his daughter. It's a massive, like 600-page volume where she goes all over the place. There's so many non sequiturs there. It's like you're watching a courtroom debate, right? And she writes about her father, but it's a hagiography through and through. Her father can do nothing wrong. And then there's a dissertation that wasn't published, and it was written in the 70s, and only talks about Ames's public life, but it misses a lot of things. And so I decided to write my master's thesis on Adelbert Ames. And I graduated with my master's in 2015. I go to Auburn in 2016, and I decided to keep writing about him. So it's not just that Ames is the person that's the subject of my first book, is that I've worked on him and studied him for a decade now. So it's been a long time coming. So if you have questions, I should know the answers. I have no excuse to not know the answers. But Ames is a Mainer. He is from Maine. He's born in Maine on Halloween, actually, in 1835. He is born to Jesse and Martha Tolman. Oh, I went the wrong way. Tolman Ames. Is the right way? There we go. And so that's a picture of Adalbert when he's a young man, and that's his father and that's his mother. It's important to talk about his origins because they play a pretty big role in shaping his life. His father is a highly respected man. He's actually a sea captain. And so in southeastern Maine, in East Thomaston, where he lives, there's shipbuilding, there's lime kilns. That's the industry. And so his father is actually a captain who has sailed all around the world. Ames travels with him. His mother comes from a very respectable family. And when Ames is growing up, I think this is kind of funny, But his mom is really worried because Ames likes to go down to the docks where there's a lot of rougher people, a lot of older people, and pick fights. That's his pastime. And his mom's like, I don't want him to do that anymore. So she teaches him how to sing, play instruments. They read Aesop's fables. But his family's also very politically involved and politically active. And they're hardcore Whigs. This is, of course, before you have the Republican Party. And literally the family makes fun of that one crazy uncle who's a Democrat. Like, that's kind of like their attitude. But they're hardcore Whigs. They're staunch Whigs. They're staunch anti-slavery folk. And what's interesting about Ames is that he's not really concerned about slavery because it's not really in his backyard. He doesn't really care about it. It doesn't bother him. But what changes a little bit is when Ames actually travels with his father and they end up going to a port city that has a slave market. And he sees the enslaved folks, and that's when things start to change a little bit and starts to get a little bit more real. Well, if you want to talk about a profession that people would respect, it's the military. And if you want to join the military, you're going to want to go to West Point. That's the logic. And so Ames, I keep clicking the wrong thing, guys. All right, Ames goes to West Point Military Academy. And as you can see, when he graduates, he's part of that last group of classmen that get out when the war is about to kick off. So he's there graduating with people who will eventually be fighting on the other side and against him. Ames is a pretty good student for the most part. He gets one demerit, though. He's not perfect. He doesn't return a library book back on time. So he's actually a pretty good student. He becomes a corporal of the cadet corps. He's an excellent student. He's going to graduate 5th in his class, so he does pretty well for himself. But the big talk in 1861 is this war that's brewing, and his classmates are wondering what they're going to do. Well, there's really no question as to what Ames is going to do. He's going to, of course, serve in the Union Army, and he's so smart that they think they're going to put him in the engineering corps, but he actually doesn't. He's going to go to the U.S. Artillery. So he's a young lieutenant, and his commanding officer for this artillery battery is a man named Charles Griffin, who's also going to become a pretty well-known Union commander during the course of the war. But he graduates in 61, he goes to D.C., and he immediately gets involved in the Battle of First Bull Run. And so this is actually, when you see maps like this is from my book, as a matter of fact. And so Ames is right there in the midst of the battle. For those of you that are familiar with Bull Run, Henry Hill is a key central location for the battle. And eventually that's going to be one of the linchpins where the Confederate forces are eventually going to counterattack and break through later on that muggy afternoon. And so Ames and his artillery are right smack dab in the middle of the fight. So when there stands Jackson like a stone wall and there's that Confederate counterattack, Ames is right in the midst of it, okay? So he's right there at the very beginning of the Civil War in a lot of ways. But while he's overseeing his guns, he gets hit by a round, slams right into his thigh. It's probably a smoothbore, big caliber round, and because it's a smoothbore, it kind of wiggles all around. It's not like a clean entry or exit wound. So he's bleeding pretty profusely, but he refuses to be removed from the battlefield, okay? He's a young man. He's only about 24 years old at this time. So what he demands is that his men put him up on the caisson behind his guns so he can still see everything and not be on his feet, which I think is doubly crazy because he's sitting on top of the ammunition. So if there's a stray round that hits the ammunition, I don't know what could happen there, but I know there's black powder in that thing. But also he's elevated, so he's putting himself in a really bad spot. So even though the smoke is hanging in the air, eventually his position gets overrun, but his men don't retreat. They actually start clubbing them with the equipment that they have and firing with sidearms and all that. But remarkably, Ames is actually able to get saved. His men drag him away, and they put him on this really bumpy, rickety wagon. He has to go all the way back to Washington, D.C. with this giant hole in his leg and dying men all around. A pretty grisly thing for someone who's just a young man. And I know this seems like unrelated, but I always like to include this picture because you have massive guns during World War II, but the calibers are comparable to the calibers of the muskets during the Civil War. So a 50 caliber machine gun, 58 caliber musket, it's a big round that's hitting into you. It's got some force to it. So Ames gets hit, but remarkably, he doesn't die. His leg doesn't get amputated. And to kind of give you some foreshadowing, he's going to win the Congressional Medal of Honor for his conduct there. So that's just his first battle. Right out of the gate, he's going to be later on, he's an older man when this happens, but he's going to be awarded for courage and valor because of his very first engagement. Now, he's going to get promoted. That's a common thing with Ames. And he's involved pretty much in the next big campaign in the Eastern Theater, which is the 7 Days campaign. He's actually someone who experiences firsthand Quaker guns, the fake guns that are meant to disguise your position and claim like you have more defenses. And he's getting bottled up on the peninsula with McClellan. He's not really happy. Ames likes action. And so he fights at multiple battles. He fights at Oaks Grove. He fights near Savage Station. And at Malvern Hill, his artillery is exemplary. And so he's still a young man. He's only a year removed from graduating from West Point, and already he's got a lot of big fans. Now, a lot of things he gets on his merit, but it also helps if you've got a very connected family in Maine, and you've got a lot of recognized Mainers in the military. And also Hannibal Hamlin, the vice president under Lincoln, is also from Maine. So that helps you out kind of when it comes to promotions. And even though Ames likes being in the regular army, he likes being a captain in the regular army, he actually decides to accept a commission as a colonel in the volunteers. And he's going to become the CO of a new regiment, and that regiment's the 20th Maine, which is a regiment that people know about. There's been books written about them. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is highly recognized. This becomes a very decorated regiment. But Ames, this is one of those great examples where Ames is starting to become interwoven with some famous units and famous people. Now, Ames shows up, and he's one of only 2 people in the entire regiment that have any military experience. His second-in-command, Chamberlain, has no military experience. He's a professor at Bowdoin College, okay? So Ames has to start from scratch. Now, for those of you that have read books about all of these volunteers, it's not an easy life transitioning to the life of the soldier. The order, the repetition. Heck, we know that their bodies aren't ready because they're not accustomed to all these germs. I'm reminded that even in the North, which is way more industrialized, most people grow up on farms. They have no interaction with large swaths of other people. So disease is just spreading everywhere. But also Mainers, even today, has anybody been to Maine before? Anybody been up there to Maine? Mainers are a unique breed. They're still kind of odd ducks, and they're very independently minded.
It's the only redneck state in the North.
There's rednecks everywhere, I would say, but Maine's definitely got plenty of them. And so these guys know how to shoot, and they're tough, but that toughness works 2 ways. They're tough because they can adapt to soldier, but they're also tough because they don't like being told what to do. And so Ames has to whip them into shape. And there's soldiers, though, that are writing home that say, you know what, if someone were to accidentally shoot the colonel, no one's going to be that upset. Or we hope that Johnny Reb picks him off in the first battle. Likewise, Ames hates these guys because if you think about it, he's been working with regular army. He's been with U.S. artillery. Those guys are trained. They're professional. Both sides hate each other. In fact, Ames gets so mad that he ends up charging at some of his men with his saber drawn. In fact, the marching band, which is just as paltry as the rest of the regiment, can't keep a tune. They can't march. And while Ames is trying to get his men lined up in an order of battle, because he knows they need to know this if they're going to survive, the marching band, blaring loudly, marches right in front of him while he's trying to work on his regiment. And so he draws his sword and chases them, screaming at them. Ames is like 26 years old. He's 25 years old. And the regiment is not so happy with him, and he's not so happy with the regiment. In fact, when they finally ship out and go to Washington, D.C., he flips out at his men because that's where they get their muskets. And it's as if they were never trained how to march before, now that they've got 10 pounds on their shoulder. And he's like screaming at them because they're embarrassing him. They're in Washington, D.C. in front of the regular army, and they can't march. And Ames is definitely a prideful person. So if you're someone who wrestles with pride, he's a simpatico person. But all of that changes in December at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Now, we're familiar with Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg is a pretty sound defeat for the Union Army in the Eastern Theater. But Ames and his regiment, they get baptism under fire here on December 13th. Now, they were at Antietam, but they didn't actually fight in Antietam. Ames is a part of Griffin's brigade now. Griffin's been promoted. And they're known for being one of the last units to march across the open field at Marye's Heights and go against the entrenched Confederates behind that stone wall. And despite the fact that they're green, they don't retreat, and they start to actually appreciate Ames because he's leading from the front. They also start to appreciate Ames because the toughness and tenacity he drilled into them is starting to pay dividends now they're on the battlefield. But for those of you that are familiar with the 20th Maine, they don't retreat that night. They stay out there that night because they can't actually get back. So think about this. You have a young colonel, a new regiment, never seen combat before, and they're out there overnight stacking the bodies of their dead comrades to use as cover. And not only that, but they can't even get out the next morning because what's the problem? Well, it's light now and Johnny Reb can see Billy Yank. So they're out there until the next evening when they're actually able to retreat. And an ironic twist, Ames actually becomes appreciated by his men, and inversely, he starts appreciating his own men because they held up, they did their part. Ames is going to do something that I think, looking back, some people probably thought was disrespectful. Other people consider it patriotic. I leave it up to you to decide. But he's already been vaccinated, or rather inoculated against smallpox. His men haven't. So they're in quarantine. And Ames wants to keep fighting. So he takes a temporary assignment with another general, a man named George Meade, by the way, a recognizable person. So Ames fights at Chancellorsville, but his regiment doesn't. So that big defeat where ultimately Stonewall Jackson gets wounded, Ames is in that battle, but his regiment isn't. And because of that, he then segues that to serve elsewhere, and he ends up stepping away from his regiment. Some people said it was patriotic. Other people said he should have stuck with his regiment. But for the record, almost every soldier in the 20th Maine that's wanting to fight in that battle is using the excuse that they already have had their smallpox inoculation. They should all fight. So there's multiple people, not just Ames. But because of his leadership, he ends up getting promoted to the rank of brigadier general. He's the youngest infantry general in the Union Army. He's 27 years old. Have you ever heard the phrase the boy generals before? Does that sound remotely familiar? Men like Elon Farnsworth, Wesley Merritt, George Armstrong Custer. There's a crop of these young, aggressive generals that the Union Army promotes in 1863. The unique thing about Ames is he's the only one that's taking command of the infantry, which is a lot more of a challenging responsibility. What's also challenging is his first battle is at the Battle of Brandy Station. Now, I don't want to be quizzing people, but I know I got Civil War minds here. What kind of battle was Brandy Station? Anybody recall? The biggest cavalry for the war. But Ames isn't cavalry. He's infantry. So he's having to command infantry on a battlefield that's being tactically overseen by cavalry, which is a really confusing situation to be put in as a young general. But also, clearly, it was the government making decisions because they decided to not just have him command the brigade he was supposed to command, but they give him an amalgamized brigade. So he's not even commanding the men he's supposed to command. They pick and choose different regiments from the different corps, combine them into this special brigade to tag along with the cavalry. I actually think this is one of Ames's finest moments. He's fighting a cavalry battle with his infantry who, well, they can't move nearly as fast, can they? And he's not even commanding his regular regiments. He's commanding troops he'll never command again. And yet, he ends up getting out of there unscathed, and his men end up holding up in the midst of that fighting. But as we know, this battle happens as a precursor of a much larger battle that's going to take place in the next month. And that battle, of course, is Gettysburg. And Ames, of course, finds himself in the midst of that battle because on day one, Ames, who's a part of the 11th Corps, is going to find himself in a really precarious situation. Not only are the Union troops outnumbered at the beginning of day one, but his superior officer, Francis Channing Barlow, is shot, and they think he's dead. They think he's dead and gone. And so Ames, again, 27 years old, only been a general for about a month and a half, now has to command a division. And he also has to be responsible for creating the defensive positions around Cemetery Hill. That's kind of where the very corner of the fishhook is. He's also, during the second day of fighting, having to repulse serious attacks from the Second Corps. Ultimately, Ames and his division and his corps are able to hold fast, and he gets a lot of credit for what he's able to do during the vicious fighting. But there's a cool moment that takes place during this particular battle. Afterwards, on Independence Day, July 4th, 1863, Ames has his first chance to observe the battlefield as a whole. He's been stuck at Cemetery Ridge for 48 hours, fighting off the Confederate attacks. And so he starts riding and exploring the line, and all of a sudden he hears these giant cheers coming up out of nowhere. And it turns out that it's his old 20th Maine who have had quite a fight themselves on Little Round Top on the second day. And so they cheer him. He salutes them. It's kind of a very neat moment where they're both respecting each other when a year before they didn't like each other so much. So Ames is flying really high. He's a brigadier general. He served valiantly. But he ends up going through what is one of the most depressing moments of his life. And he has a couple of depressing moments. I think that Ames may have struggled with depression during the course of his life. But he decides that while he'd rather stay with his men, he's willing to go wherever his superiors order him. So he gets sent to the Department of the South. And so for almost an entire year, he's stationed in either South Carolina or he's stationed in Florida. It's hot, it's muggy, it's buggy. He's stuck on either Morris Island or he's stuck in Jacksonville, Florida. This is actually a photograph of Morris Island. It's just a bunch of sand and bugs. That's basically where he's living. And he's livid that he's living there. He's also, as I said, kind of got a prideful streak in him. So he approaches his commanders and says, you know what, I've got this really great idea how to take Charleston and take Fort Sumter. And his commanders ignore him and he has a pity party. So he's really mad that like his brilliant idea doesn't happen. And of course, as we know, Fort Sumter is not taken in 63 when the Union tries it. So he then gets relocated to Florida because President Lincoln has big plans to take Florida and go on big excursions. But if any of you have been to Northeast Florida, there's a battle called Alustee that's there, which is a big defeat for the Union. And so all the Union troops retreat and they get to Jacksonville right when Ames shows up. And Ames is ready to go. And they say, nah, we're just going to stay put. So Ames is bored out of his mind. He basically says, I take a carriage ride every other day around the town. And he doesn't use the word bored, but he's bored. And so, again, I don't understand why superiors make certain decisions. But apparently some of the brainiacs in the military says, you know what? Ames is a smart guy. Why don't we put him in the cavalry? He's already served in the artillery. He's a good engineer. He's a good soldier in the infantry. Let's put him in the cavalry. He'll check off all the boxes. And other people are like, why? Like, he's good at these other things. Why put him somewhere we don't need him? So after a lot of fighting, they ultimately decided that they're going to relocate him to Virginia during that big campaign where Ulysses S. Grant has arrived and he's going to take it off with Lee and all that stuff. But then the problem is he's such a good administrator that his administrators in Jacksonville, Florida don't want him to leave either. So he's kind of like being like a tug-of-war victim because everybody wants him to go do these different things, and it's because he's a person who has a lot of aptitude. He's ultimately going to get brought up to Virginia, and during the big Virginia campaign in 1864, he doesn't actually serve with Grant. So when Grant is fighting with Lee, he's actually not a part of that. He actually serves with Benjamin Butler. Good old Ben Butler, the Beast of New Orleans, that character. The fact that he serves with Benjamin Butler here, to kind of give you some foreshadowing, is life-altering. And I'm not kidding when I say that. His relationship with Benjamin Butler is going to be life-altering. What's not life-altering is the Bermuda Hundred campaign, which kind of fails in a lot of different ways. One of the things, though, I think that's really impressive is when we look at history, we look at tremendous things or large things or big people, and sometimes, things matter, right? Like the big stories. Like in World War II, the Normandy landings, that matters, or the Sicily invasion with Operation Husky in Italy, that matters. But also the small decisions that are made behind the scenes, like how are we going to resupply the landings? Or how are we going to organize our aerial reconnaissance? Like those things don't get the big headlines, but they matter. And Ames kind of has one of those moments here because while Butler and his men are struggling to keep on moving down the James River and ultimately get towards Richmond, there's a battle that doesn't happen, but that battle that doesn't happen is arguably the most important battle during the Bermuda Hundred campaign. Ames, for some reason, is told not to actually engage in the primary movement of Butler's army, but to stay in reserve. And meanwhile, General Whiting is brought up from Petersburg with about 5,000 Confederates to help reinforce the Confederate line. And as they're marching up, they notice in the distance some Union troops. That's Ames. Ames has one infantry regiment, one cavalry company, and a handful of guns. He does not have a lot. He has nowhere near 5,000 men. But what he does is kind of like we see in nature with certain animals. He puffs out his chest, proverbially speaking, and pretends like he's got a lot more than he has. He starts flexing his men, and they're only in single file, but they look like they're much wider. And so instead of actually attacking Ames, the Confederate reinforcements are convinced there's too many Yankees here. We can't bother doing this. If the Confederates attacked Ames, they would have overrun him. If they attacked Ames, they would have been completely behind Butler's men and could have closed on them, and they would have been enveloped by both the Confederates in front of them and now 5,000 Confederates behind them. So I think that in a brilliant tactical move, Ames fought, well, he didn't fight a battle. He bluffed a battle. So it's not going to be in the history books. It's not going to be something that, is embellished in paint or it's on a coffee cup. But it's going to be one of these battles that helps save thousands of Union lives and kind of helps preserve a very fledgling campaign. Ames then relocates to Petersburg. Petersburg becomes a siege, and he also is caught up in a pretty big moment too. We're familiar with the crater, right? The disastrous event in which Union troops run into the exploded, detonated mine. Well, Ames is actually responsible for saving thousands of lives there too, because his division is supposed to be the last division on that attack. And he looks ahead and says, this is a bad idea, and he keeps his men back. And afterwards, during the inquiries, Ames gets praised by men like Meade and Grant for saving more lives. In fact, Grant famously says that if he had more generals like Ames, he might have won the war sooner. You can actually look that up. It's actually in Grant's memoirs. He mentions Adelbert Ames. I personally like this. We got the laser very good. I personally like this photograph. This is Ames right here with his division staff. At one point, he's actually the commander of the 10th Army Corps. So he's basically as high as he could be without being an army commander at one point. I don't know whose dog that is, but like all dogs, just sleeping. But Ames, it's as if, I know people don't smile back then, but if this was his, when you look at this picture, I just think that's like Harumph. If Harumph was a picture, that's this one right here. He's grumpy in this picture. Now, I know nobody smiles, but while Ames is at Petersburg, he's utterly miserable again. In fact, he's so miserable about the way the war is going, he's writing home to his very now staunchly Republican family that he hopes Lincoln loses. He's not happy with Lincoln. He's not happy that this war is dragging on. In fact, he's actually somewhat convinced that maybe McClellan will be a better president because at least he was a general at one point. But ultimately, we know that Abe wins. Ames feels like he's going to be stuck here forever. But his former commander, Ben Butler, decides that he wants to lead an expedition to take out Fort Fisher. Has anybody been to Fort Fisher, North Carolina, or been to the Outer Banks area of North Carolina? One of the most important and the last Confederate bastions on the coast is Fort Fisher. It's not been taken since the start of the war. Oh, they've tried, but it is earthen mounds. It's guarding the Cape Fear River. In fact, historian Rod Gregg calls it the Confederate Goliath, as in it's like the last great Confederate stronghold. Well, Butler decides he wants to take it, and he completely fails. And so in December, Ames and his men are unable to attack because they had this crazy harebrained scheme.